The muffled roar of the aircraft engines was a familiar song for Lúcia, 38, an experienced and naturally skeptical flight attendant. For almost 2 decades, the sky had been her second home. The narrow airplane aisles her domain. She knew every sound, every vibration, every nuance of flights, and her intuition was as sharp as her professionalism. But something changed at the small airport in Casper, Wyoming, an unassuming stopover on her international connecting flight from Los Angeles to Frankfurt. The terminal, usually bustling, seemed strangely quiet, the air thick and heavy. Lúcia felt an icy chill, alien to the summer temperature of the American Midwest, run down her spine. It wasn't the air conditioning. It was something deeper, a premonition that made her shudder. The premonition came not as a vivid flash, but as an ethereal whisper, a murmur at the edge of her consciousness. Suddenly, the image formed with terrifying clarity. On the second takeoff, the landing gear failed. She didn't see the scene in graphic detail, but she felt the impact, the deafening reverberation. A fatal collision on the runway, a mass of twisted metal and dark smoke. And the silence that followed, a silence colder than Arctic ice, would embrace the runway, swallowing the unspoken screams. Lúcia tasted something metallic in her mouth. The smell of ozone and something burning seemed to invade her nostrils. Her eyes widened, fixed on nothing, as dread took root in her chest. Her heart, accustomed to the calm of high altitudes, beat a frantic rhythm, a drum of warning. The vision reverberated in Lúcia's mind like a distorted, persistent, and relentless echo. The smell of kerosene, once routine and almost imperceptible, now hung heavy, permeated by a funereal premonition. Marcos asked, his eyebrow arched, a look of concern tinging his tired face. He had known her for years, knew she wasn't one for dramatics or superstitions. It's been a lot of flight hours, Marcos tried to rationalize, his tone still condescending, almost paternal. She couldn't risk it. She couldn't allow her colleagues, her second family, to board for certain death. But out of them, her actions were, at the very least, unusual, perhaps even alarming. Sophia, however, seemed more impressed by Lúcia's conviction and despair than by Marcus's rational words. The air in the Casper terminal suddenly seemed denser, muffled, the hum of distant announcements sounding like a muffled requiem for the impending flight. Lúcia felt the gaze of the few passengers who were already beginning to board, some of them curious about the commotion in the crew area. The urgency swelled within her like a tide. "Please," she pleaded again, her voice low but firm, a final appeal. "Trust me this time." She knew that fate was relentless, an unmoving force, but perhaps, just perhaps, it could be fooled, diverted from its course. Time was running out, each second feeling like a hammer striking her chest, and the second boarding call blared loudly over the loudspeaker, like a countdown to tragedy. "I refuse to go, and you shouldn't either. Please, don't board." The urgency in her voice was palpable. He reached out to touch her arm, but Lúcia instinctively flinched. She saw the twisted fuselage under the cold runway lights, the metallic gleam of the wreckage, and felt the heat of the impact even before it happened. "It's going to fail on the second takeoff," her voice broke, laden with an urgency that even surprised herself. Sophia, still assimilating the situation, looked between the two, apprehension beginning to take hold of her young, naive expression. The distant hum of the plane being refueled seemed muffled by the escalating tension. A wave of nausea hit her forcefully, making her stomach churn. This couldn't be simple flight fatigue, the jet lag that accompanied her profession. The agonizing clarity of the image was too disturbing to be ignored. Her lips trembled as the words, laden with a dark certainty, escaped. "I can't board." Her voice came out hoarser than she expected, immediately drawing the attention of Marcos. 45, a co-pilot, a burly man with a face marked by years of flight fatigue, and Sophia, 26, a rookie flight attendant, her eyes wide with curiosity and surprise. Lucia, what happened? Are you okay? I saw it, Marcos. I saw the accident. The landing gear. Accident? Lucia, you're tired. You need to rest. But Lucia didn't yield. The image of the collision was seared into her mind with painful precision. The screams she couldn't hear but felt reverberating in her soul. Marcos hesitated. Lucia's authority in the air in crisis situations was unquestionable. The radio in the airport lounge, an old crackling set, broke the heavy silence that had settled between Lucia, Marcos, and Sofia. The metallic sound of static filled the room, amplifying the already almost unbearable tension. Her hands trembled uncontrollably, a tremor that spread throughout her body. The smell of burning, acrid and nauseating, began to spread, invading the lounge, clinging to their clothes, to their skin, making the air almost unbreathable. The lounge seemed to shrink, the air becoming thin, suffocating. Lucia closed her eyes tightly, trying to ward off the persistent images that haunted her mind. The dancing flames, the dark smoke. She couldn't stop thinking about the passengers, the crew members who hadn't heeded her silent warning, the innocent lives lost. The sound of the sirens grew louder, a chorus of agony, and then, as abruptly as it began, a sepulchral silence descended upon the airport. A silence that weighed more than any sound, more than any scream. It was the scale of silence she had predicted, a silence that spoke of death, of irreparable loss, of a cruel fate that had manifested in all its fury. And Lucia, no matter how many times she had dodged death, knew that the game with destiny was far from over. The feeling that something was still pursuing her was almost palpable. A premonition nestled in her chest like an icy serpent, waiting to strike. Lucia felt as if she were trapped in a vivid nightmare, every detail of her premonition coming to life in a grotesque and cruel way. The visual impact of the burning aircraft, though she couldn't see it directly through the foggy window, was as real as if she were there in the midst of the destruction. A wave of selfish relief, mixed with overwhelming guilt for having survived, washed over her. She had succeeded. She had saved Marcos and Sofia, but at what cost? Guilt was a heavy burden. What she had seen in her premonition was not a hallucination, nor a nightmare, but a terrible reality unfolding just meters away in the deafening silence of their minds. Marcos, who just moments before had doubted her so vehemently, was now as pale as a ghost, his eyes fixed on the radio as if awaiting a miracle or perhaps a denial. Sofia brought her hands to her mouth, a sob caught in her throat, her eyes brimming with tears. The distant sound of emergency sirens broke the airport's quiet, increasing the tension in the small room, invading their ears with a premonition of disaster. The air traffic controller's words were drawn out, interspersed with pops and interference, but enough to chill the blood in all three of their veins. Emergency. Flight 714. Landing gear failure. Imminent collision. I repeat, imminent collision on the runway. The controller's voice, previously calm, was now tinged with panic. Lucia felt a chill that didn't come from the air conditioning, but from a much deeper, darker place. Outside, the cold Wyoming breeze seemed to carry the lament of lost souls, a lament that seemed to come directly from the runway. The minutes dragged on like hours, each tick of the clock on the wall a reminder of the fleeting time. In the days that followed the tragedy in Casper, news of the plane crash spread like wildfire, dominating news reports across the country. Images of the twisted fuselage, of the black smoke rising against the blue Wyoming sky, were endlessly replayed. The mood in the city was grim. The Wyoming sky seemed gray even on sunny days, as if the very air was sad. Lucia tried to resume her routine, returned to her apartment in Los Angeles, tried to distract herself with the office work assigned to her, but the shadow of the premonition hung over her like a dark cloud. She felt observed, as if destiny itself had eyes and was studying her, waiting for the right moment to cast its next trap. Paranoia slowly began to set in, like a thick fog. Walking down the street, driving her car through the busy avenues of Los Angeles, even the simplest tasks of everyday life were tinged with a subtle fear, a chill that nestled in her chest. What would come next? Lúcia knew that the tragedy at Casper Airport was not the end, but rather the beginning of a relentless pursuit. She had cheated death once, but would she be able to do it again, and again, and again? The answer, she feared, was unfolding in a dark and cruel plan, a cat-and-mouse game with mortality itself. She felt strangely connected to those who didn't survive, as if their lives had been traded for hers in a dark pact with destiny. The landing gear failure was confirmed by NTSB investigators, initial reports echoing Lúcia's premonition with chilling accuracy. Brenda died in a car accident in Denver, more than 200 miles from Casper, on a rural road. The local newspaper reported a blown tire and loss of vehicle control. For the police and the public, it was a fatality, a common accident. For Lúcia, it was the first shiver of a dark omen, an icy feeling that fate, or some invisible force, was settling scores, collecting its debts. Brenda's death, not destined for that flight, seemed like a misplaced piece in the puzzle of chance, an anomaly in a universe that should be ordered. The air in Lúcia's house, which she shared with her neighbor, suddenly seemed heavier, laden with the residual smell of smoke, even though she knew it was just a trick of her trauma-stricken mind. Lúcia, Marcos, and Sofia were exhaustively interrogated, their detailed stories about refusing to board and Lúcia's premonition. Obviously, the premonition part was met with skepticism by most, but their absence on the fatal flight was undeniable. They were the survivors, those who, in some inexplicable way, had escaped death. Casper Airport, once a fleeting transit point, was now a silent monument to the tragedy, enveloped in an aura of mourning. A week later, news of the death of Brenda, the substitute flight attendant who had taken Sofia's place on the fatal flight, arrived abruptly and cruelly. With each passing day, the silence around Lúcia seemed more deafening, broken only by the distant echoes of the news on television or the anxious sound of her own thoughts. The synchronized deaths began to unfold with macabre precision, weaving a tapestry of fatalities that seemed to defy logic. First, Kevin, the flight engineer who had replaced one of Marcus's colleagues on Flight 714, died in a house fire in Salt Lake City, just days after Brenda's death. He called Lúcia at any hour of the day or night, his voice choked with fear and exhaustion. "Lúcia, do you think this?" She began to have recurring nightmares, waking up amidst muffled screams and cold sweats, and refused to leave her house, paralyzed by dread. "I feel like I'm being watched, Lúcia," she confessed in a video call, her eyes swollen from crying. She slept poorly, the original premonition of the plane crash mixing with fragmented visions of her own potential deaths. She saw a car speeding towards her, a fall from a tall building, a silent explosion that enveloped her in invisible flames. Destiny seemed to play with her, offering glimpses of her imminent end, only for her to escape by a thread, a mere second, a single movement. But for how long? The pursuit was relentless, and Lúcia knew that sooner or later, destiny would collect what it considered its own, the life she had stolen. The tension grew, tightening its grip around her throat with each new fatality that hit the news, each new face she recognized from the flight crew photos. As if there's a countdown for us, and I can't see it. "Has to do with us escaping?" he asked one night, his voice trembling over the phone, the line crackling between them. The distance between Casper and Lúcia's home in Los Angeles, where she was on extended leave, seemed to shrink, terror spreading like a dark stain. The air in her Santa Monica apartment felt heavy, the salty smell of the Pacific mixing with the anxious odor that hung in the air. The report indicated a short circuit in an old electrical installation. Lúcia read the news on an online news portal, her hands trembling over the keyboard, her breath caught in her throat. The coincidences were too frightening to be ignored, forming a sinister pattern. The mosaic of fatalities was completing itself, seemingly orchestrated by an invisible entity with an obscure purpose. She and her friends had escaped the plane, but fate seemed determined to collect its debts one by one. Marcos, in turn, began to show increasing nervousness, bordering on collapse. Sophia, on the other hand, the youngest and most optimistic of the trio, was also hit by the wave of fear, her previously vibrant energy now dull. Lúcia began to see traps everywhere, on every corner of bustling Los Angeles. The traffic light that suddenly failed at a busy intersection, almost causing a collision. The elevator that got stuck between floors in her building, leaving her trapped in claustrophobic darkness. The subtle smell of gas in her kitchen that she swore wasn't there a minute before, but now seemed strong and menacing. Every trivial event transformed into a potential harbinger of death, a reminder that destiny was lurking. She began to avoid crowds, preferring the isolation of her apartment. The smell of gasoline at gas stations made her recoil in disgust, reminding her of the fire that consumed Kevin. The sound of a tire blowing out on the street, coming from a distant car, made her jump in fright, evoking the image of Brenda's car accident. The silence in her house was overwhelming, broken only by the sound of her own accelerated breathing, by the heartbeats that echoed in her ears. The noose tightened around Lúcia and the few remaining survivors of that cursed flight. With each new death, the hope of escape seemed to dwindle, replaced by growing despair. Dr. Arthur Jenkins, the medical examiner who had worked on the bodies from the plane crash in Casper, and whom Marcos had met during the interrogations, was found dead in his Phoenix office. She found herself avoiding busy streets, preferring longer, more isolated paths where the possibility of an accident was lower. Lúcia was exhausted, her eyes red and sunken with deep dark circles. She could no longer trust her own judgment, her own sanity. The traps were everywhere, disguised in everyday events, waiting for the right moment to manifest. The phone rang, and she hesitated to answer, fearing the next news of death, the next name crossed off the list of survivors. The silence of the night was a torment, filled with the ghostly sounds of screams and explosions that her tormented mind created, echoes of a tragedy that refused to leave her. She knew she was in a cruel game with fate, a game where the rules were unknown and the score fatal. And what was worse, she felt that the end, her own end, was near, a shadow that loomed larger with each beat of her heart. She refused to take elevators, climbing countless flights of stairs, feeling the exhaustion in her legs, but preferring it to the risk. She distrusted everyone who watched her for more than a second, every casual glance turning into a menacing scrutiny. The sound of a plane flying over her house in Los Angeles made her shudder, evoking the accident scene, the sound of the explosion in her mind. The warmth of the California sun seemed not to warm, but rather to burn her skin with a sense of urgency. That time was running out. She felt like a target, and the shooter had perfect aim, invisible but relentless. The official cause was a supposed heart attack, a sudden illness. Lúcia learned the news from television, the doctor's face blurred on the news screen. One more piece in the grim puzzle, one more life taken too naturally to be a coincidence. She could no longer breathe deeply. The air felt thin, heavy with omens. She felt trapped in an invisible web, every movement, every decision, seeming like an invitation to danger, one step closer to her own end. Marcus's anxiety turned into absolute panic. He decided to sell his house in Chicago and move to an isolated cabin in the Rocky Mountains, seeking refuge in the middle of nowhere, in the vastness of untouched nature. Lúcia, what do you think we should do? There's nowhere to run. I'm going crazy here, he asked desperately over the phone, his voice echoing the vastness of his solitude. There's nowhere to run, Marcos, Lúcia replied, her voice a barely audible thread, resigned. The air in her apartment seemed to contract with each word. the smell of dampness in the air mixing with the cold sweat that ran down her forehead, a silent witness to her torment. Sophia, on the other hand, tried obsessively to understand what was happening. She delved into research, scouring the internet for any explanation. She researched premonitions, legends of fate, and ancient curses. She sent Lucia an article about survivors' curses, where people who escaped major tragedies died in strange circumstances shortly after, as if death was correcting an anomaly. Reading the article sent an even deeper chill down Lucia's spine. The smell of old paper and ink from the article seemed to fill the room, amplifying the fear, making it almost tangible. "Lucia, this isn't chance. It's something bigger, something we can't fight." Sophia typed in a message, her voice in her audio almost a whisper. "Fate wants to collect." Lucia tried to run, but every attempt seemed futile, as if she were running in a maze with no exit. The tension grew day by day, tightening its invisible claws around her chest.